Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Wednesday, the 21st of September. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 210 of the illegal Russian war of aggression. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. Vladimir Putin has announced a partial mobilization in Russia in a significant escalation that places the country's people and economy onto a wartime footing. Putin also threatened nuclear escalation, saying that Russia had lots of weapons to reply to what he called Western threats on Russian territory. Putin's speech was swiftly condemned by Western leaders. The Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, said that 300,000 Russians with previous military experience would be called up. According to the decree signed by Putin on Wednesday, the contracts of soldiers fighting in Ukraine will also be extended until the end of the partial mobilization period. The Ukrainian presidential advisor, Mikhailo Podolyak, said Putin's decision to announce a partial mobilization was a predictable step that highlights that the war was not going according to the Kremlin's plans. Lithuania's defense minister, Arvydas Anušauskas, has said that the country is to put its rapid reaction force on high alert, as the mobilization will also occur on its border with the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. Latvia's foreign minister, Edgars Rinkēvičs, said the country will not offer refuge to any Russians fleeing Moscow's mobilization of troops. The proxy Russian authorities in 4 occupied areas of Ukraine have announced on Tuesday their intentions to hold referendums between the 23rd and the 27th of September on joining the Russian Federation. The Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, speaking in a video address released earlier today, said in relation to the referendums, "Our position does not change according to this noise or any other announcement." Kyiv said that the sham referendums were meaningless. The White House rejected Russia's plans to hold referendums, adding that Moscow may be making the move to recruit troops in those areas after suffering extensive losses on the battlefields. Several world leaders have said that they will not recognise any referendums or new annexations of Ukrainian territory, with the French President Emmanuel Macron calling the plan a parody. With Germany's gas storage facilities at just over 90% capacity, Robert Habeck, the economy minister, said that Germany now stands a good chance of getting through the winter. Germany is ahead of its goal to have the subterranean stores 95% full by the start of November. And also in Germany, police have raided several properties understood to belong to the Russian oligarch Alisher Usmanov on suspicion of money laundering and violations of EU sanctions. Now, we're lucky this evening to be joined by a regular contributor, Richard Thomson MP. Richard is the Scottish National Party MP for Gordon and has been an MP since the 12th of December 2019. In 2015, he became the leader of the SNP group of councillors on Aberdeenshire Council, serving as co-leader until 2017 and as leader of the opposition of the council until he stood down following his election to Westminster. Richard currently undertakes the roles of Shadow SNP Deputy Spokesperson Treasury, Financial Secretary, Shadow SNP Spokesperson for Northern Ireland, and the Shadow SNP Spokesperson for Wales. Richard, good evening. How are you keeping?
No bad, Andrew. How's yourself?
All the better for seeing you this evening. Thank you for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland this evening, Richard. We're very grateful to you. Now, in a powerful speech at the UN General Assembly this afternoon, President Biden condemned Russia's naked aggression in Ukraine as an affront to the heart of what the UN stands for. Mr. Biden called on allies to stand firm in backing Ukrainian resistance to Russia's aggression. President Biden called Putin's invasion of Ukraine illegal and reckless. The US president said, "A permanent member of the United Nations Security Council has invaded his neighbour, attempted to erase a sovereign state from the map. Russia has shamelessly violated the core tenets of the United Nations Charter," as he accused Vladimir Putin of causing a brutal, needless war. This war is about extinguishing Ukraine's right to exist as a state, plain and simple, and Ukraine's right to exist as a people, the American president said. Wherever you are, wherever you live, whatever you believe, that should make your blood run cold. President Biden condemned Putin's irresponsible nuclear threats, saying a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. The US president added that Moscow was ignoring a non-proliferation agreement and conducting an unprecedented concerning nuclear buildup without any transparency. Earlier, Vladimir Putin had announced a partial mobilization in Russia in a significant escalation that places the country's people and economy onto a wartime footing. The president also threatened nuclear retaliation, saying that Russia had lots of weapons to reply to what he called Western threats on Russian territory, and added that he was not bluffing. Putin's statement followed the announcement of plans to hold referendums on becoming part of Russia this weekend in the Russian-occupied regions in eastern and southern Ukraine. As I reported earlier, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky condemned the Russian referendum plans as a noise and thanked Ukraine's allies for denouncing the votes. So, Richard, quite striking news from Russia this morning, with President Putin delaying his announcement and his video address until it was a better time for his Asian citizens to hear the news. So I was going to ask you firstly, in a more general sense, how does one go about handling a wily old bear who has managed to get himself stuck in a trap of his own making and is now starting to panic? And who do you think should do the handling of that wily old bear?
Well, I think you should leave the wily old bear to twist and turn and thrash about in the trap of his own making, frankly. Quite clearly, he's had to trim his war objectives. Initially, the idea of take Kiev within 3 days. Latterly, it was about taking the Donbass region as his ambitions were curtailed by the strength of the Ukrainian resistance. And now, in a bid to try and sound reasonable, the message has got out through President Erdogan of Turkey that he's looking for ways to end the conflict. Well, marvellous, but it seems to be that now, with the prospect of these 4 referendums, he wants to annex, fight rigged referendum, or hold rigged referendums, claim that those parts of Russia, parts of Ukraine, are then henceforth Russian territory, as he's done with Crimea, and hope that some of the rhetoric about won't tolerate incursions or attacks on Russian territory somehow then extends to that, and that people will accept that. But look, I think the thing that shines through in this is, there's a few things actually. The first thing is, if somebody in politics has to say, I'm not bluffing, the chances are they're probably bluffing. Secondly, in terms of the shrieking threats from certain of his former spokespeople, including one which I was fortunate enough to miss on Radio 4 this morning, threatening to use nuclear weapons against European cities, including London. I think we can just park that as the inflammatory nonsense that it is, because there's no however cornered he is, there's no strategic advantage to him in doing that. There's no advantage in the battlefield of using so-called tactical nuclear weapons. I think we should always be careful of the distinction, because the yield of some of these tactical weapons in terms of their destructive power is even greater than the bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I don't see what advantage he gets out of anything like that. Either of those threats, other than the hope that it might destabilise what's been a fairly strong and united front against him so far, which is what's backed him into this corner. A little word on the partial mobilisation, that's been announced. Again, if he genuinely thought that the motherland was at threat rather than, as the Russians term it, they're near abroad, I think we'd have seen a much larger response in this, and we'd have seen it a hell of a lot sooner than now. The idea that it's being restricted only to those who have reservists, who have some military experience, well, they pulled together a third brigade, and it's fallen apart within a matter of weeks. So they really are scraping the barrel here in terms of the personnel that they're hoping to bring forward. But also, as we've seen, even with their supposedly more elite forces that they put into the first and second orders of battle, even then, their equipment and their logistics just wasn't up to it. So quite what he imagines is going to be able to do with any additional boots on the ground that he thinks he can might bring to bear, I really don't know, because they've been outthought and outfought at every turn so far by the Ukrainians out with the first couple of weeks of the conflict. I think the final thought I have on this is, as other observers have noted, I think quite astutely, that this, up until this point, he's been able to rely on a compliant media domestically within Russia and to promote war almost as a form of entertainment for people to enjoy from the comforts of their own homes. This is the first time that the impact of the conflict is really going to start affecting ordinary Russians, when it's their children who are conscripted in effect to do this. And also, you're going to see, because people are going to be taken out of the productive parts of the economy, you're going to see a very big economic hit from this, just as we've seen from sanctions. The more of the national Russian effort that goes into trying to fight this war that they can't win, the less is there to provide for basic needs. So not only is his prestige going, the economy is going to tank even further. And for the very first time, an awful lot of households all across Russia, including in the Asian parts of Russia that he was trying to speak directly to with this message, are going to start feeling the effects of this conflict directly in their own families, and not just those who are signed up as professional soldiers, families of those who are signed up as professional soldiers. So I think this is a sign of how serious it is for Putin now. But in terms of how you deal with it, well, you certainly don't gain any advantage from yielding to the man. I think you just keep on doing what you're doing and giving the Ukrainians every support that it's reasonable to give them to help them achieve their mission of restoring their territorial sovereignty.
Thank you, Richard. A number of very good points well made there, and in particular, as you say, sticking to the plan that's working. Let's move on now, because back in the UK government has announced an emergency package of government support for businesses, which includes a cap significantly reducing the price paid for energy from the 1st of October to help them get through the winter. The UK government has discounted wholesale power prices for companies, charities and public sector organisations, including schools. Under the plan, they will be given support for 6 months to protect them from soaring bills. Further help will be offered to companies in vulnerable industries after that. When announcing her energy support package for households earlier this month, Liz Truss said that the government would also launch a new scheme for all non-domestic customers. The price cap from the energy regulator for Great Britain, Ofgem, on the typical domestic bill does not apply to businesses, meaning that firms had been facing costs that were due to rise even more sharply than for domestic users. The Westminster Business Department has now announced a supported wholesale price, expected to be £211 per megawatt hour for electricity and £75 per megawatt hour for gas, which it said would be less than half the wholesale prices anticipated this winter. The cap means that electricity prices for business customers will still be about double what they were in October 2021, when the price per megawatt hour was £117, but more than half the forecast winter prices of about £540. The scheme limits the price suppliers can charge customers for units of gas and electricity. Businesses will not need to take any action, as the discounts will be automatically applied to their bills. The changes will apply to new contracts from the 1st of October and to fixed contracts taken out since the 1st of April this year. The government said that those on default, deemed or variable tariffs will receive a per unit discount on energy costs up to a maximum of the difference between the supported price and the average expected wholesale price over the period of the scheme. The amount of this discount is likely to be about £405 a megawatt hour for electricity and £115 per megawatt hour for gas. So, Richard, firstly, in terms of what we've been hearing today, is this, as usual with this Tory government, a case of too little, too late, and for too short a period at only 6 months?
Well, I think I can understand why they've gone for 6 months, because we're just about to go into the most intensive 6 months of the calendar year in terms of energy usage. But I was still to get across the detail of this ahead of the fiscal event on Friday. Today's mostly been spent travelling and doing other things in Westminster. But before we go back, but my gut feeling is it's probably not going to be enough for enough people and enough businesses. Um, to get a one-third reduction for businesses, that's fine, but it's still a massive increase in costs. And for a lot of businesses that were maybe operating at the margins, this is still not going to save them. And again, in terms of the support for households, again, we'll hear more about the detail of that. But for all that people might reasonably expect to have to pay a little bit more because of the increase in wholesale prices, this is still going to be beyond the budgets of an awful lot of households, whether they're in benefit of this targeted aid or not. I think that the fundamental problem here is that the government are kind of they're trying to firefight, and really the fundamental problem here is one to do with inflation. Now there are, I think, three main drivers of inflation here, and let's just be clear: inflation isn't running out of control because there are too many people running about with too much money. That's simply, the traditional explanation of too much money chasing too few goods. That's just not happening here. So the Bank of England potentially ratcheting up interest rates seems to me to be a particularly inept way to try and deal with it. I know that that's their main tool for controlling inflation, is to make the cost of money a bit dearer, but that's not tackling the problem here. It's only going to make it worse. What you need to do to tackle the cost of living crisis is to reduce the costs and get more money to those who are most likely to spend it on the things that they need. And we've seen an awful lot of people get very wealthy, paradoxically, over the course of the last couple of years and the pandemic, doing quite well. The super wealthy, are doing absolutely fine. Not everybody, only a very few people fall into that category right enough. But fundamentally, you need to have a redistribution from those who are less likely to spend money at the moment to those who are more likely to spend it. But the biggest the two other drivers, there's the supply chains round about COVID that haven't returned to normal. That's kind of affecting inflation as well. Brexit's a peculiarly British factor that's certainly not helping at the moment. But the big input is energy costs. Now, it hasn't cost. The reason the cost has gone up isn't because it's suddenly costing more to extract hydrocarbons. It's because the one man, Vladimir Putin, and the removal of Russian gas from the market. Now, we all understand the reasons why that is, and it's good that we're weaning ourselves off that, or Europe is weaning itself away from Russian energy at long last, because the benefits of that cheap energy were purely illusory and came with all sorts of other price tags, as we're seeing in Ukraine and in its aftermath. But fundamentally, the cost of extracting hydrocarbons hasn't gone down. So what we need to do is to get the cost of energy down substantially, and more substantially than this package is doing, because it affects the cost of everything. Every good that's on a shelf, every good that's delivered from an Amazon warehouse, at some point it's on the back of a van or a lorry, and the costs of transporting it are going up. The cost of energy inputs for our food sector, for our farming sector, it all feeds through into the cost of everything. So, that's why we're seeing it feeding through into quite reasonable pay claims, which are very, very high, and which governments are struggling to meet just now. But ultimately, that's not what's going to quench the flames of inflation. It's about getting the input costs of energy down for businesses and the productive parts of the economy, so that people don't have to spend as much on getting the everyday essential products that they need. And that is what's going to take the heat out of this. But even then, when you look at and I'm glad that the government has recognised that the public sector needs to benefit from this, the benefits of this energy cap as well, because this is going to knock hell out of council budgets as well. Councils that have to heat all the buildings that they're responsible for, nursery schools, primary schools, high schools, care homes. It's going to feed all the food that they buy, in terms of the increased input costs that we've spoken about there, but also the cost of procurement of all the other goods that are also affected by costs of transport and the costs of, hydrocarbon-based inputs. It's all going through the roof, and it's all eating in fundamentally into the ability of our local authorities to provide services, our health board to provide the levels of care that they want, our IGBs to provide the social care that's needed. It eats into absolutely everything. So the one thing that the government absolutely needs to do this week is hit energy prices and hit them hard, in terms of the cost that the end consumer ends up paying. Because I think the government would not be forgiven if they were simply to basically underwrite energy company profits by throwing all this onto the national debt and effectively rolling out the cost of this to the taxpayer over the next 10 or 20 years or however much in terms of servicing that debt. We need something more fundamental than that. We need to make sure that those entities and individuals that are capable of shouldering the heaviest burden are the ones who do so. And in order to get over our low growth, low productivity, and high inflation economy, we need to make sure that the money is going to those who will use it best in terms of providing for themselves or families, maintaining living standards, and as I say, taking the inflationary pressures out of the economy that come from these excessive energy wholesale prices at the moment.
Absolutely, thank you, Richard. We'll be looking at inflation and the impact of energy costs further later on this evening. But you're absolutely right to bring it up now because it's absolutely what's at the root of the problems that we're facing and that we're talking about tonight. But let's look for a moment at, as you were talking about, more targeted action on soaring energy bills, because the UK government has been urged by the devolved government to fund its cap on energy prices through a windfall tax, not higher borrowing. In a joint letter to the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng, Deputy First Minister John Swinney was joined by finance ministers from Wales and Northern Ireland in calling for more targeted support to those impacted the most by the cost of living crisis. They expressed their concern that more action is needed to prevent further hardship for households and businesses and say that support should be funded by targeting the windfall gains in the energy sector rather than passing on the cost through higher borrowing. The finance ministers also called for additional funding to support vital public services in the face of rising prices, energy costs, and wage pressures, as devolved settlements are worth considerably less in real terms than last October when they were fixed. So, Richard, the letter from the finance ministers of the three devolved governments said that those governments have exhausted the options available to them to address the cost crisis, stretching every pound available to them to provide support. They say that the main levers that can make a difference are held by the UK government, and it must now take urgent steps to use these to provide much needed certainty to those suffering hardship and poverty. Now, the letter's out, it's a very well written letter, but the fact of the matter is that a Truss government isn't going to use those levers, is it? It's going to lock those levers off. It appears to want to make poor people poorer, and it also wants to take the devolved governments out at the knees, at least in financial terms.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's the danger about fixed budgets. I spoke in my last answer about the impact of the current financial situation on the public sector, which is operating within budgets fixed by the Scottish Government, which, let's not forget, is operating within a budget that is substantially fixed by Westminster. And even if you do want to use other levers, your borrowing powers are minimal to meet, revenue mismatches from year to year, and your tax powers can only be set once in the financial year. So there's very little that you can do to get around that. I think also it has to be said about the Truss government. They may not want to, they may not like windfall taxes, but they're not about to take away the one that's there. But I'm unpersuaded about their means of funding the package that has been mooted so far. And it remains to be seen how much of that remains intact after, once Westminster goes back tomorrow and on Friday, because I think there's an awful lot of people who are quite jittery in the Tory ranks, and rightly so, frankly, about this. But it just speaks volumes for how ideologically wired to the moon the slot are. That they still think trickle down economics is the way that works, and out of all the cohorts of people most desperately in need of uh, huge pay rises, it's the bankers that should be first in the queue by getting bonuses, their bonus caps lifted, but they can already get bonuses double their salary, even as things stand. I think we've got a new government that seems to think that the disaster capitalism and creating money out of chaos for a few is the way to do it. That financial speculation brings its own reward for the speculators, and that somehow that creative destruction of capitalism somehow creates something that's better for everybody. The countries that do well, that have the longest, that have the greatest life expectancy, that perform best in terms of well-being indices, that perform best in terms even of traditional measures such as GDP. And I know that not everybody likes that, but it's the best economic measure that we have for the moment. All of these countries that tend to excel in these measures in terms of healthiest, happiest, wealthiest, not only are they usually smaller countries with more cohesive political units there, but also they're the countries that invest in social value, and they don't allow their economies to get overbalanced towards one particular sector, such as services, at the expense of manufacturing. They try to have they specialise in the areas that they can, because that's what you have to do. But at the same time, they want a rounded economy, built on many sectors, and they don't have that over reliance on one particular thing, such as we have in the particular kind of speculative financial services that we have in the City of London particularly. So, as I say, it takes a peculiar mindset to look at the way things are across the UK at the moment and think that the people who are being hardest done by are the bankers who can't get more than double their salary in a bonus. Quite frankly, the government needs to look more widely and share the burden more equitably. And if that means looking at energy profits, then certainly should do that, because energy profits are being made at the moment that are not reflective of any particular skill or judgment in terms of the way that the companies are being run. That's not to say there isn't considerable skill and judgment in the way these companies are run, because they are. There is, but this is something that is literally a windfall at the moment, and the increased cost to the consumer is not something that's been reflected, as I said earlier, in the increased cost of production. So we need to be looking at lots of different ways to meet this challenge, and looking again at windfall taxes rather than just simply chucking it on the national debt and leaving it to future generations to service.
Thank you, Richard. And I think what we'll do for the next item is we'll drill down a little bit on the points that you were making earlier with regard to what it is that's driving inflation and what it is that ought to be done to address that. Because the Bank of England is considering the biggest interest rate rise in 33 years to tackle soaring inflation, a move that is expected to cost millions of households more than £3 billion in extra mortgage costs. City investors expect the Bank of England to raise interest rates by at least 0.5 percentage points, or even 0.75 percentage points on Thursday at the next meeting of its Monetary Policy Committee. In a development heaping renewed pressure on borrowers, a rise from the current level of 1.75% would aim to underscore the central bank's commitment to tackling inflation, which is at its highest level since the early 1980s. Trading in financial markets reflects an 80% probability of a 0.75% percentage point increase, which would mark the biggest single rate increase since 1989, when inflation was soaring due to a consumer boom, which immediately before the onset of the early 1990s recession. However, experts said that the bank pushing ahead with the biggest rate hike for more than 30 years would mean an extra £3.1 billion of interest payments for borrowers on standard variable rate and tracker mortgages. So, Richard, economists have said that the proposed freeze on energy bills will help to prevent headline inflation from rising much further than the current 9.9%. But as you were saying before, it's the current energy costs that's the co-driver of the rampant inflation in the UK. Price control on energy costs, because it's energy costs which are driving inflation, not consumer borrowing and not consumer spending. So why is it, do you think, that the Treasury and the Bank of England are trying to fix the problem by tinkering with the wrong part of the economy?
Well, I have some sympathy with the Bank of England, because they have a mandate from the government to control inflation, and this is effectively the big lever that they have to pull. If the government doesn't want to have to start writing letters to the Chancellor explaining why the inflation targets are being overshot. But the thing is, as I said earlier, this is not, and as you said yourself there, Andrew, this is not inflation that's being driven by people having too much money to spend, and there are too few goods being out there for them to spend it on, and a combination of oversupply of money and uh, uh, an over an excessive demand, pushing this up. As I say, three main factors: supply chains still out of kilter after COVID, the self-inflicted wound of Brexit, but it's energy costs. And any government that isn't getting to grips with energy costs is not going to get to grips with inflation. And quite frankly, all higher interest rates are going to do is take more money away from people to spend on necessities. It's not even going to be good for savers, because we all know the banks aren't going to pass on, the full interest rate rise to their savers. And if inflation is at 10%, then your savings are getting eroded at that rate as well, if you have any. So it's not as if it's even good for savers. So at a time when people are looking to tighten their belts, it maybe makes sense to try and pay down debts, particularly if interest rates are going up. But it's not going to do anything to tackle the fundamentals that are driving the the current inflation here, or get us out of the kind of inflationary pay cycles that we're already starting to see come. I mean, you could say one good thing about the inflation of the 1970s, it was accompanied by big pay rises as well. So, it was a great time to have a mortgage, because your endowment mortgage, if you had one, the bonuses that were getting added to that were fairly hefty, and the amount that you'd borrowed was getting eroded by large levels of inflation every year. I suppose if you want to go back far enough, you could say that if you were being facetious, Weimar Germany was a great place to owe somebody money, because a few days later it was a fraction of what it was that the sum that you would have borrowed. But we don't want to get that. We've got used to having sound money, if you like. We've got used to living in a period of low inflation. An awful lot of that low inflation was being imported by cheap consumer goods, particularly white goods from China, by labour, by a plentiful supply of labour coming from Eastern Europe. Those days are quite possibly over for a number of reasons now. Maybe we are having to transition, until we fully get to grips with the renewables revolution. Maybe we are having to transition to a high cost of energy economy, when the cost of our energy has always been relatively cheap for most of us. But we really are about to drop off a cliff edge here if we're not careful, in terms of the impact on household incomes, and in terms of the impact on businesses. As I've said, there are a lot of businesses that I know from my own post bag in the Gordon constituency that are heavily dependent on hydrocarbon prices for the cost of inputs, whether that's energy, whether that's road transport, whether it's the things that you make from hydrocarbons like plastics and polystyrenes, or dry ice for the food industry. And unless the government seriously gets to grips with that, not all of them are going to be here this time next year. And that's it's sad, but it is avoidable if the right act is taken at the right scale now.
Thanks, Richard. As you say, action this day in order to begin to address this. But let's look at another aspect of the cost of living crisis and the effect on the national economy, because the UK government borrowed £11.8 billion last month. That's almost twice as much as the Treasury's independent forecaster had expected, as high inflation pushed interest payments to an August record. The figures from the Office for National Statistics provide a difficult backdrop for the Chancellor before his mini-budget on Friday to address the cost of living crisis. Government borrowing was £2.6 billion less than in August 2021, but £6.5 billion more than the same month in 2019. That's before the coronavirus pandemic. The August deficit was almost double the £6 billion predicted in March by the Office for Budget Responsibility, the fiscal watchdog, mainly because of an increase in government spending. It was also higher than the £8.8 billion forecast by City economists. Debt interest payable by the central government rose to £8.2 billion last month, the highest figure for August since records began in 1997, because of the effect of high inflation, as measured by the Retail Prices Index, on government bonds. So, Richard, this morning the pound fell, I think, to nearly $1.13 after the ONS data showed UK public sector borrowing up to almost £12 billion last month, against an estimate, a forecast of £6 billion. Now, given how important a trading partner the US is, and how much trade is carried out in US dollars, I'm thinking oil, this drop in the value of the pound against the dollar, it's just going to push up the cost of living even more, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's a bit like Harold Wilson's famous "The pound in your pocket isn't worth any less as a result of devaluation when we used to have such things. But of course, the pound in people's pockets is going to inevitably buy less, particularly when it comes to imported goods. I'm less concerned about borrowing because borrowing is an important part of economic management, depending what part of the cycle you're in. And the borrowing that was done or the surplus of expenditure over revenues, put it that way, that was taken on throughout the pandemic was absolutely the right thing to do to keep demand there. Now, it was perhaps inevitable that not every business was going to survive COVID. There would be a drop off in economic activity, but the whole point was to preserve it and make sure you were in a bit better position than you would otherwise have been in, and that's largely what has that's largely what has happened. What I'd be more concerned about is some of the other indicators on the dashboard rather than borrowing or the cost of it. It's when you're looking at tax revenues that are lower than expected, when you're looking at the balance of payments, when you're looking at how it's much more difficult to export now because you've walked away from a whole load of trade deals that came as part and parcel of your membership of the European Union. When you see investment coming down, when you see consumers tightening their belts, because again, your economy, your GDP is your consumption plus your investment plus your government expenditure, plus your exports minus your imports, and on all of these things at the moment, except and all of these indicators are not are all kind of pointing south, and uh, the one thing that maybe is helping to push things up at the moment is government spending and keeping that demand there, and but inevitably the ideology that the Conservatives have, that will be the next thing that they're going to try and they'll try and push even further down on that, and it becomes a kind of self perpetuating spiral downwards, sadly. So, as I say, the cost of debt. Nobody wants to be paying those sorts of levels, but let's not beat ourselves up too much about why we're there. It was as a result of conscious policy decisions that were necessary in light of the pandemic. If we weren't doing that, we'd have felt a great deal more pain, a great deal sooner, and in lots of other ways. So now it's there. We've just got to suck that up. But it's the other indicators that are alarming me, and that's when it starts to come down to things like your post-COVID supply chain and the impact of Brexit, and failing to deal with the next, existential shock or exogenous shock, as the economists would call it, in terms of energy prices, and start looking
Yeah.
at some of the policy decisions as the SNP have been banging on about for years that you can take to sort this, investing in housing at scale, investing in energy efficiency, investing in renewables so that you're not writing blank checks effectively to private entities to build nuclear power stations that they'll then liquidate the corporate entity that owns it as soon as you have to pay a penny in decommissioning costs. Let's get rid of sweep aside the bogus capitalism that's basically underpinned by the state, and let's pump prime the areas of the economy that need pump prime to deal with this, because we can lay the foundation. This generation, we're in for a bumpy few years, maybe a bumpy decade or two economically, perhaps even more than that. The very least we can do is to lay the foundations of a better tomorrow for our children and our grandchildren, in terms of how we repurpose our economy and repurpose our productive capacity to meet our needs and to meet the challenges of the future. And I think we're just being shown up some of the unsustainable aspects of the model that we've been able to live with for the last 40 years. And a whole number of factors are coming home to roost in that. And I think the historians will look back and see the kind of post-Cold War period. It was almost like maybe a little bit like the 1930s. We were also engrossed in ourselves and with the benefits that globalization was bringing, and that we had the end of history, and it was always going to be perpetual peace and prosperity. That liberal democracy had won out. Well, that came back to bite us. And if we really want to build a if we really value the kind of society that we've had, things are going to if things are going to stay the same, they're going to have to change, as somebody once said. And there are some significant policy changes that we can start to put into place at pace at the moment. But worrying about the debt is not uppermost in my mind at the moment. It's all the other indicators and the long-term problems that have come home to roost there that I think any government with an eye to the long term, rather than maybe just a general election perhaps 2 years away, should be focusing on.
The future and investment, absolutely, Richard. Thank you. Now then, you mentioned there a better future, and for our next item, we'll be looking at better together and prospects for a better future, because it seems that Douglas Ross's newly appointed political advisor has been making things up. In a bizarre turn of events, the Scottish Conservative leader withdrew his job offer to Craig Patterson after it turned out that his claim to have been a special advisor to former Scottish Labour Party leader Jim Murphy wasn't true. Responding to the news about Mr. Patterson's sacking broken by the Times, Jim Murphy tweeted, "This story caught my attention. I have never knowingly met this guy, let alone employed him in any role ever. A bizarre fantasy from the Scottish Tories." Strangely, no one seems to have questioned why someone who claimed to have been a political advisor for New Labour would want to work as a political advisor to the Tories in Scotland. So, Richard, after the overnight events in terms of the payroll and HR issues at Scottish Conservative headquarters, it's reported that the Tory party in Scotland has now launched an internal investigation into how this could all have happened. So, what do you think they will find at Tory headquarters as part of this investigation, apart from one empty cupboard marked new policies and maybe another completely empty cupboard marked the positive case for the union?
Oh, I really don't know what they'd find, but I think we're used to the Tories making things up. But the idea that you would make up that you'd worked for Jim Murphy is frankly bizarre. I think when you look at them, this Jim Murphy was a guy who was out boasting after he got made the lead, after he undermined Joanne Lamont, and he then went out, he jogged 50 yards in a retro Scotland top and drank a can of Iron Brew to show how down with the kids he was and how Scottish how much more Scottish he was than anybody else in the political firmament north of the border. And then boasted about how he was surprised how easy it was to outwit the SNP. And then the juggernaut came along, and there was only one of them left standing, and it wasn't Jim. So why you would boast of having been part of that political organisation is beyond me. Why anyone would have been impressed by it is beyond me. The only thing I can think of is that the Tories must have thought that it would show how mainstream they were in terms of Scotland. This was how cemented they were in their place as the challenging opposition party in Scottish politics. It's somebody so closely associated with somebody so closely associated with New Labour would wish to be part of that new true blue Tory revolution under Douglas Ross. Now that the Ruth Davidson Tories juggernaut has gone off the road in spectacular fashion, but I think there's an element. You assume that before they gave him the job, he must have interviewed quite well. He must have presented as being quite plausible. My surprise is that they would have announced his employment so gushingly before they'd carried out a few checks like that. But the other bit that puzzles me is what's eventually undone him. I mean, Scotland is a place where it seems at times like there's 2 degrees of separation rather than 6. And in politics, everybody knows everybody practically. So the idea that you could have said that you worked for one of the most high-profile politicians in Scotland at the time and not get found out, it's just utterly, utterly bizarre. So, I think that the Tories are due to ask themselves a few searching questions about this. But I think the interesting bits are, how, just, the most one of the most interesting and telling bits is the fact that they thought it was such a good hire to take somebody who'd been so closely associated with Labour, and it just shows how closely some people think that the Labour and the Tories are in Scotland. Particularly when their unionism overlaps as it does. But much ado about not very much, but it's interesting, some of the deeper stories it tells, and it's a day where everybody gets to laugh at the Tories. So I'm sure we're not going to miss the opportunity to do that.
At least for a minute, absolutely right. And I suppose that we can only just say it must be half confusing being Douglas Ross at the moment, and we have to think of him at this difficult time. But let's get back to more news now, because in New York today, the New York State Attorney General Letitia James filed a civil lawsuit against Donald Trump and members of his family, the culmination of a years-long investigation into the financial practices at the Trump Organization. In a statement, the Attorney General said the suit was filed against Donald Trump, the Trump Organization, senior management, and involved entities for engaging in years of financial fraud to obtain a host of economic benefits. The Attorney General stated that the lawsuit alleges that Donald Trump, with the help of his children and senior executives of the Trump Organization, falsely inflated his net worth by billions of dollars to induce banks to lend money to the Trump Organization on more favorable terms than would otherwise have been available. To satisfy its continuing loan covenants, induce insurers to provide insurance coverage for higher limits and lower premiums, and to gain tax benefits, among other things. Announcing the suit, Letitia James said that the complaint demonstrates that Donald Trump falsely inflated his net worth by billions of dollars to unjustly enrich himself and to cheat the system, thereby cheating all of us. He did this with the help of the other defendants. Ms. James also said investigators believed the conduct alleged in this action also violates federal criminal law, including issuing false statements to financial institutions and bank fraud. She said, "We are referring those criminal violations that we've uncovered to the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York and the Internal Revenue Service." So, Richard, should we be surprised that a property developer who's notorious for lying and fraud is now accused of lying and fraud in connection with his property developments?
That's a very loaded question, and since my lawyers probably aren't as good as yours, I'm going to sidestep. But no, I think it's interesting. I mean, lots of questions have been asked about the apparent discrepancy between the wealth that the personal and corporate wealth that the Donald Trump and the Trump Organization spoke of, and the tax returns that they filed, about the reticence about the personal tax returns that he filed, and about quite how he was able to finance so many things that he did while while his tank appeared to be running on empty, and his ability also to bounce back from some notable business failures. How he always managed to, or how he was managing in some cases to walk away with leaving creditors unpaid, but yet able to sail on. Now, the case that's been put forward by the Attorney General in New York State, I think paints a plausible explanation for why he might. Trump and the Trump Organization might have been able to do that, but of course the place for that to be examined is in a court of law, and I can't imagine that an investigation that's been going on quite so long as this one appears to would have. The Attorney General of the New York State would have come forward with such an incendiary set of accusations if they didn't feel that they were able to substantiate it. So all I'll say is that there's certainly a case that looks like it's there to answer, and I think what goes on in court when it eventually gets there will be very interesting indeed.
Absolutely, Richard. Thank you. And if nothing else, we will be following the money as ever with Trump. Now, there are two Scottish stories left, but we're a little bit tight for time. So I'll read the penultimate story, and then we'll talk about the final story this evening. Firstly, every child and young person in Scotland is being encouraged to get involved in a national discussion on education. Let's Talk Scottish Education invites those aged 3 to 18 to share their views, ideas, and experiences. Feedback from young people, as well as from parents, carers, teachers, and others working in education and beyond, will play a vital part in shaping the future of education. This will include the reform programme that will see the creation of 3 new education bodies and a review of qualifications and assessment. This national discussion, which is being co-convened by COSLA, will run until the 5th of December. It is being independently facilitated by Professor Carol Campbell and Professor Alma Harris, who will report their findings to ministers and COSLA in the spring of next year. Schools are being invited to take part in the discussion in ways that best suit them and their learners. This may be through classroom discussions or at home or with friends. Discussion guides have been issued to schools to help encourage involvement. Children and young people can also contribute by emailing the Scottish Government or through social media using the hashtag Talk Scottish Education. More information will be made available over coming weeks on other ways that young people can get involved in online and regional events. And also, strategies to attract foreign investment and open up international trade for Scottish companies have reported successful results. The Business Minister, Ivan McKee, told the Scottish Parliament that the Export Growth Strategy, a trading nation, has delivered an additional £3 billion of planned international sales in its first 3 years. Goods exports are growing more quickly than the UK as a whole, and Scotland is the only part of the UK with a positive trade balance in goods with the rest of the world, exporting £2.2 billion more than it imported in 2021. A separate progress report on the Scottish Government's inward investment plan highlights that enterprise agencies attracted 113 inward investment projects and a total of 7,780 jobs in 2021-22, with 39 new investors choosing to locate here. The latest EY Annual Attractiveness Survey 2022 showed that Scotland remains the most attractive part of the UK outside London for attracting foreign direct investment. So Richard, Neil Francis, the interim managing director of Scottish Development International, which is the international arm of Scottish Enterprise, said that global trade and investment is absolutely vital to Scotland's economy and achieving the sustainable economic growth we all want to see. Now, that's a bit of a problem, is it not? If Scotland is a trading nation and England, as you were saying earlier, since the days of Mrs. Thatcher, are not. It's a bit of a problem if Westminster just does not want to prioritise international trade, and all the evidence we're seeing at the moment, it certainly doesn't.
I mean, let's not forget pork markets and selling cheese. As the Prime Minister would be very angry with us if we didn't talk about these things. But yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to something I said earlier about the countries that tend to have the best outcomes in terms of life expectancy, educational attainment, happiness, wealth indices. They all tend to be countries with more balanced economies than the UK has as a whole, and they they tend to invest in their more heavily in their social infrastructure and in terms of parts of their economy that build genuine value. Now, there's all sorts of things. Scotland's doing well. That's a cause for celebration here in terms of the fact that we're exporting a greater value of goods than we're importing. Obviously, not every country in the world can do that, so it's good that we're one of the ones that is doing that. We've got to be wary, though. Although we're attracting investment because we're an attractive place to invest. Never let anyone say that issues about the discussions about how we should be governed through in the independence debate is driving people away. Clearly, that's not the case. The same folk were making the same argument about devolution back in the day, by and large, or their predecessors were, and it wasn't true then either. So now people are looking at the fundamentals of the Scottish economy and seeing something good. We've got a very, very well-educated workforce. We've got a very, very hard-working, productive workforce, and we've got a good location. Not as good as it was because we no longer have direct access to the single market, although we have that geographical proximity. Few dark clouds on the horizon, not just the energy costs, but also the plummeting value of the pound. That might make some exports cheaper, but if you have to import in order to export, if you're importing particular components, that sometimes, depending on the balance of that, it can even itself out over the piece, or sometimes it can make manufacturing quite difficult. So, that's I think what the industry is looking for is stability round about that. But so it's good that we're getting that bit right. We need to continue to build on our strengths, and that strength fundamentally is a good natural environment, high quality of life, good quality public services, highly educated population, world-leading universities, and carving out that distinctive voice and distinctive position that we have, and making sure that we don't allow anybody else to talk us down in the process.
Thanks, Richard. That sums it up very well for us this evening, because I'm afraid that's all that we've got time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching this evening, and I would particularly like to thank our very special guest this evening, Richard Thomson MP. Richard, many thanks.
My pleasure.
Meantime, we will be here again tomorrow evening with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us then. I'm reminded that on this day in 1745, at the Battle of Preston Pans east of Edinburgh, the Jacobites defeated the assembled government forces who were under General Johnny Cope. Cope is reputed to have wagered £10,000 that his successor as Commander-in-Chief would also be defeated by the Highlanders. Cope won his bet, and the wager is said to have made him a very wealthy man. That's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. I'm not away to place any bets on any battles this week. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening. Bye-bye.